Welcome to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We provide fiction reviews for the lit, curious reader, because why not try a little of everything? Our scholarish approach and cozy book club atmosphere makes literature accessible to everyone. Whether you're a casual reader or a devoted bookworm, join us on our literary journey to explore all genres.
Hello, and welcome back to Extra Literary Affairs. I'm Jennifer, and today Joey and I will be having an affair with Octavia E. Butler and her short story, Bloodchild. The story was first published in 1984 in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. This work is the titular story of Butler's 1996 collection, Bloodchild and Other Stories, and each story and essay features an afterword by Butler. The expanded edition from 2005 contains the additional stories, Amnesty, and the Book of Martha. So, who was Octavia E. Butler? And I was fascinated to read her very distinguished history. So, in the realm of science fiction, few names resonate as powerfully and enduringly as that of Octavia E. Butler. That E stands for Estelle. She was born on June 22nd, 1947 in Pasadena, California, and she emerged as a groundbreaking author who reshaped the landscape of speculative fiction with her profound narratives and visionary ideas. Butler's journey into the world of writing began at a very early age. As a shy, introspective child, she found solace and inspiration in the pages of books. She was also an only child. Her passion for storytelling was kindled by her mother, a housemaid who brought home discarded books from the houses she cleaned. This early exposure to literature, combined with Butler's very vivid imagination, paved the way for her future career. And despite the challenges and prejudice she faced as an African American woman in the predominantly white, male-dominated genre of science fiction, Butler's determination and talent propelled her forward. She attended Pasadena City College and later studied under the notable science fiction writer Harlan Ellison. These experiences honed her craft and solidified her commitment to her writing. Her ability to weave complex, thought-provoking stories earned her numerous accolades, including multiple Hugo and Nebula Awards. And in 1995, Butler was honored with a prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, often referred to as the Genius Grant, recognizing her exceptional literary contributions and creative genius. And I know this is a lot of information, but she really was a powerful force. So we're wrapping up and getting to the end of her career here. Throughout her career, Butler's works challenged societal norms and expanded the boundaries of science fiction. She envisioned futures where marginalized voices were not only heard, but were central to the narrative. Her legacy continues to inspire a new generation of writers and readers, cementing her status as one of the most influential figures in the genre. Octavia E. Butler's death in February 2006 took everyone by surprise as she was living in Seattle and died after a fall that some think was possibly the result of a stroke. She was only 58 years old. The obituaries in important papers across the country emphasized her pioneering role in creating a space for people of color in science fiction. And one of my favorite things that I learned in investigating who this woman was is that in several interviews, Butler said she wrote because she had two choices, write or die. If I hadn't written, I probably would have done something stupid that would have led to my death, she said cheerfully. And we are so fortunate that she chose to write. So, Joey, is there anything else that you'd like to add about your experiences with Octavia E. Butler? I believe that this is the first time that I have read her work. There is a possibility that I have been exposed to her name and knowing who she was, but I don't think that we've explored this in the past.
No, not here. We haven't read it here, but I actually just read Parable of the Sower, which is part of the duology, the next one being the Parable of the Talents, or Parable of the Talents, not the. It was fantastic, and it was extremely eerie. Some people thought that Octavia Butler was a prophet because she was so accurate in what she wrote about that people are like, you must be able to tell the future. And she was like, no, I'm just using logic and data, and I'm guessing, and I got it right. I mean, Parable of the Sower starts in 2024 with fires in LA, and I was like, oh. And President Donner, sorry, I almost said it. I was like, oh my God. And then it gets eerily close to the our present day. I'm excited to read the other half, Parable of the Talons, which she says is a fictional autobiography of the main character whose name is Lauren. So you have to really read them together to get the full scope of her story, which is very interesting.
Joy, I love that. And I don't know exactly the years in which she wrote those two collections that you just spoke of, but I'm like, if
Mm.
she died in 2006, all of those things that you just mentioned that came to pass that she had written into her narrative, I'm like, that was such a wild card. That was so out of the realm. It was science fiction, it was speculative fiction when she was writing it. So I'm just always super curious when those things come to pass.
She wrote it in 1993.
Apparently, like a million years ago in my life experience, it's like, wow, that seems like a really, really long time ago.
Well, what are you trying to say? I'm old because I was born in 1992. I was alive when this was published.
Yeah, so Joey, that does feel like a completely different world for me. We were in a different world before Joey entered the world, and we're very glad
Hmm.
that you're here. So, I would love to transition to doing a quick summary of what this story was about. And as a reminder, this is Octavia E. Butler's story, Blood Child. And here's the summary. In an alien settlement called the Preserve, humans, or Terrians, coexist with the Tilic, a centipede like parasitic species that requires Terrian hosts to incubate their eggs. In exchange for protection, Terrian men serve as hosts. How hospitable. The story follows Gan, a young Terran bonded to Tagoti, the Tilic ruler of the Preserve, who is destined to carry Tagoti's eggs. Gan's family consumes sterile Tilic eggs, which have a narcotic and life extending property, though his mother, Lien, does so very reluctantly. A crisis arises when Bram Lomas, a Terrian host, suffers as Tilic eggs inside him unexpectedly start to hatch. Tagoti enlists Gan to assist in the gruesome birthing procedure, exposing him to the brutal reality of his future role as host. Gan witnesses Tagoti extract the Tilic grubs from Bram, leaving him psychologically traumatized. Outside, Gan's brother Kui reveals a darker tale of a host devoured alive by Tilic offspring, deepening Gan's fear and revulsion of the fate which is set out for him. Haunted by these revelations, Gan contemplates suicide with his father's hidden rifle, seeking to reclaim autonomy. Confronted by Tagoti, he challenges their relationship's imbalance. Tagoti offers to use Gan's sister, Hoa, as an alternative host, but Gan, recognizing the selfishness of this choice, accepts his role as host. He demands the rifle remain as a symbol of mutual vulnerability and his relationship with Tagoti. In the end, Gan and Tagoti proceed with the implantation or impregnation, depending on how you want to look at it. Gan confesses his complex feelings of fear, possessiveness, and a desire for equality, while Tagoti vows never to abandon him, forging a deeper, more equitable bond between them. So, Joy, that was a lot. I think that was a pretty clear summary of the main plot points of the story. But I can say that, as we always do, you have to read it to believe it. The beauty of the writing, I think, will really transform this plot outline into a very enjoyable read, which for me left a ton of open moral questions. So, Joy, I'd be really curious to hear what were your impressions upon reading this for the first time?
The first time I read it, in the very beginning, I was like, I don't know, I can't pronounce these names, and I read a lot of fantasy and science fiction, so I understand the struggle of readers like me. You make it up what it's going to sound like sometimes because you're like, I can't pronounce this. And it's a made up word, so it doesn't really matter. But sometimes it does hold you back because you're like, I can't really connect to these characters or these places because I cannot pronounce them. So you can't, and then you don't really want to skip it, but whatever. So at first I was a little hesitant to be like, I don't know. And I never really read anything else by Butler prior to this. I did read the graphic novel version of Kindred, which I really liked, and I want to read the actual book. And I knew, of course, of her and her oeuvre, but I had not read her actual prose yet. So as I gradually got into the story, I was like, oh my God, this is genius. This is amazing. And then by the time I was finished, I was like, we have to discuss this because it's fantastic. There are so many themes and topics we need to discuss that we're both really interested in talking about. And even though I said to you when we were discussing which stories we were going to discuss, that I call this my wild card option because it's science fiction. It's extremely gory and graphic. Octavia E. Butler does not hold back with the description of birth in the story. So it's not for everyone, but I think if you can get past the fact that it takes place on an alien planet and that it's very gruesome, then you'll really appreciate all the themes because they're fantastic and I love them.
Thank you for saying that, Joey. So when you proposed this, I was like, oh, yeah, I've heard of Octavia E. Butler before. We've got to read her. This will be great. Expand my horizons. But you do know me. And so I started reading the story and I was like, what's with the names? I cannot
Hmm.
relate to this in any way. I'm done. I'm like, no, 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 just press on, just press on. So I will tell you, I did read it and I was like, wow, this is a great story. If I can get through the awkwardness of my own self of not being able to say the names. So then I was like, well, how about I listen to the audiobook version? And I did. So I did a tiny little baby cheat of trying to have someone else pronounce those names for
Oh
me.
no, that is how I do it. That's if I don't know how to pronounce it, I will find an audiobook so that I will learn.
And it was totally worth it. But also, me being me, Joey, it's like just because I heard it pronounced correctly does not mean that that is going to come out of my mouth
Yeah.
with any sort of consistency. So, dear listeners, thank you for allowing me a little bit of creative license where I will acknowledge that my pronunciation of these interesting names that do not flow off my tongue did trip me up a little bit, but I just want to re-emphasize what Joey said. It's like, don't let it distract from the story because the story is so good. And Joey, I know you're going to be surprised to hear this from me. Maybe I've been infected with some sort of new science fiction appreciation, but I'm like, I didn't find this too gory. I've been watching a lot of babies being born recently, and so I'm like, I am down
On
with the birth
TV, I mean.
on TV, but it feels real, Joey. Like I am in it. It didn't feel as gory as some of the things that I have currently seen. So I will say,
Okay.
perhaps from the male and female perspective, I have had a whole lifetime understanding the female reproductive system and what may or may not be a consequence for me of
Mhm.
my actions in the world. And Octavia Butler, one of the things she said, she's like, you know what I want to do with this story? I'm going to have the men give birth and let's just see how that plays out. So I really appreciated her own candidness of, can I write a story where this is believable? Does it raise the questions that I would like to examine? And is it believable? Are people going to be down with this version of a science fantasy world?
Yeah, I think there is sort of a barrier to science fiction or fantasy in particular, but I think Octavia E. Butler is so clever about choosing science fiction, not only because she probably loved the genre and wanted to see someone like her reflected in that genre, but she uses it to like lure us in and create this really sort of foreign but sort of similar place that we can expand our minds, and she has more access to that part of our mind where if we would have read this and it took place on earth and it was a role reversal where men were having to give birth to human babies, that might be a bigger barrier for her to have to hurdle to get her message across. But if it's something so foreign, a centipede like alien that is impregnating men or boys or teenagers, and they're giving birth by having to basically be split in half, like from their like from their neck to their navel, if not lower. and then have these grubs extracted. And it's so unusual and so literally alien to us that you're not really noticing the messaging that's coming across until it's, I think, too late and you've already read the entire story.
Joey, I so appreciate that you said that because for me, because she does set these really weird expectations about, oh, I have all of these limbs and Gatori's, she's putting people in a cage with her limbs, right? I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking of like the metamorphosis. I'm thinking of the cockroach story, this the famous metamorphosis. And it was very easy for me to say, okay, yep. It's like watching the movie Alien, right? Like it's maybe not my cup of tea, but it's really interesting and compelling.
Mm-hmm.
I was blown away by her humanity that she places into her human characters and how she really contrasts that with the ruling class, which is Gatori. She is part of the dominant culture who is keeping the Tarians separate for their contribution to society, which is their bodily functions, their incubation capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by making that contrast, she was able to show us so much human emotion, the good ones, the bad ones, the tricky situations with sibling rivalry and jealousy and sexuality and desire and freedom and responsibility and parental complicity with the captors. Like all of those things were in this story. So for me, even if they took out all of the science fiction elements, I am so sucked into the story. I'm like, I want to know who these people are and why they make the choices they make. And recently, I'm going to say after the past 4 or 5 episodes, we have been talking about world building. We have been talking about morality. We've been talking about how writers decide to create the rules for the world that they are dipping us into. And we have really been in the science fiction kick with a few notable exceptions, but I just really wanted to say thank you for broadening my horizons and allowing me to have something that's such high quality that I'm like, okay. We all know science fiction is not going to be my best jam. I'm not going to love it forever, but I can so appreciate all of the human touches in the story that I would read anything else she wrote. I just think she's phenomenally talented and asks us to really examine our humanity, our own assumptions about who we are and what we want to be. And I just thought that was really well done.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation for Butler's work is that she's very sort of subtle in the way that she said. I mean, this is not a very subtle story, I guess, because we have some very gory scenes, but her writing style itself feels very subtle to me. And this could be by contrast because I read Parable of the Sower and then I immediately read Jazz by Toni Morrison, and they have extremely different writing styles. I mean, Toni Morrison is very poetic, it's purple prose, it's extremely dense writing, and it's something that you can't just like speed read through. And I'm not saying you should speed read Butler's work, but her writing in general to me is very subtle. Like I said, in comparison with Toni Morrison, I think that Butler does not really judge her characters, and she really leaves a lot of space for the reader to immerse themselves in her stories. It's extremely immersive writing, and that's what I think is perfect for science fiction and fantasy. And I do want to read just this explanation of her writing provided by Gilliam's Writing Group. Butler's writing is marked by its clarity, precision, and attention to detail. Her prose is direct and unembellished, allowing readers to fully immerse themselves in the narrative without distraction. By centering marginalized characters and placing them in extreme or unconventional situations, Butler pushes the boundaries of science fiction, amplifying voices and experiences often overlooked in the genre. And I think that's a perfect explanation of her writing, that there's not a lot to distract you when you're reading it. It's just you and this story and the characters in the story and the plot. If you had to make a sandwich between you, the story, and the author, Butler is the one side of the bread, you're the meat, and the story is the other side of the bread. I love how immersive her writing is. Again, I'll use the word subtle because she's not using a huge vocabulary like Toni Morrison, where you're like, I've never even seen this word before or something. You don't have to look anything up. Her type of writing is very good for anybody of any type of reading level. Her writing is perfect for any level of reader, whether you're like a casual reader or you really like someone like Toni Morrison, where you really have to focus when you're reading. And I think everyone should read it. Everyone should read all of her work.
Joey, Pretty strong endorsement. I have to double down on it. So I want to read the first paragraph of this story as an example of like, you had me from the start. So this story starts out, my last night of childhood began with a visit home. Tagoti's sister had given us two sterile eggs. Tagoti gave one to my mother, brother, and sister. She insisted that I eat the other one alone. It didn't matter. There was still enough to leave everyone feeling good. Almost everyone. My mother wouldn't take any. She sat, watching everyone drifting and dreaming without her. Most of the time, she watched me. So I'm like, what are these eggs? Who are these people? Who's Tagoti's sister? Why is she in here? Why does the mom not partake of this? Like, are you guys doing drugs? Like, I don't know what is happening here, but I want to find out.
Mm.
And we hear this, and I'm just going to read the next sentence because I'm like, oh, yeah, here we go. I lay against Tagoti's long velvet underside, sipping from my egg now and then, wondering why my mother denied herself such a harmless pleasure. Less of her hair would be gray if she indulged now and then. And I just was captivated by the idea of we see that we're in a family system. We know that this is going to be an initiation story. The narrator, who we don't know a name, a sex, a gender, anything going on with this person, other than it was their last night of their childhood. Something big is about to go down, and we need to figure out what that is going to be. And I just loved how she unfolds that story for us, and then it ripples back in time for like, oh, well, what decisions did her mother make? What decisions did her father make? What did to go toy? Yeah, and again, we're just going to do that.
I would say to go toy, but you've been saying it to go tea, so I think that's fine. We can just say
To
that.
go
It's
tea.
a
That
it's a
sounds
it's a
so great.
made up
It's a
name.
made up name. So we're just going to have the two regional dialects
Yeah.
going there.
Yeah.
And what I appreciated about the unfolding of the story is that it really pushed my boundaries of asking what is about consent, what is about the purpose of following societal rules, who is allowed to challenge them, what are the consequences from challenging them, what is the nature of love? Is this a love story? One of the things that you had asked about, Joey, Octavia told us what she thought the story was about, and we'll talk later, maybe on another extra literary affair, about what was the authorial intent, because I have some arguments with what I think she told me the story was about and what it actually turned out to be for me. So, Joey, I was really curious about what you thought the authorial intent was. Like, what was the story about in relationship to love? Because she says something very interesting to us in the afterword about that.
Mm.
But what struck you about love in this story?
Well, it was not until I finished reading the story and I got to the afterword that I was like, oh, I was not expecting that. So I don't agree with Octavia Butler's idea of what this story is really about, which is really interesting that I disagree with the actual author. She wrote it. She knows what motivated her. I don't. And then she gave it to us, and I'm still like, I literally don't think that's what this is about. I just want to read a little bit of that because I think it's so interesting that we both seem to disagree with her. So this is from the afterword. It amazes me that some people have seen Bloodchild as a story of slavery. It isn't. It's a number of other things, though. On one level, it's a story between two very different beings. On another, it's a coming of age story in which a boy must absorb disturbing information and use it to make a decision that will affect the rest of his life. On a third level, Bloodchild is my pregnant man story. I've always wanted to explore what it might be like for a man to be put into the most unlikely of all positions. Could I write a story in which a man chose to be pregnant, not through some sort of misplaced competitiveness to prove that a man could do anything a woman could do, not because he was forced to, not even out of curiosity? I wanted to see whether I could write a dramatic story of a man becoming pregnant as an act of love, choosing pregnancy in spite of as well as because of surrounding difficulties. So I don't agree that this is a love story. I will double down. I think it's an anti-love story. I think we have a relationship that's built really on captivity and coercion. So it can't really be rooted in love because the power dynamic is so off. We have the Tillich overlord, who are the natives of this planet, who are ruling over the Terrans, who are the Earthlings that came to and now are the aliens who came here. And there is this oppressive nature. They're relegated to this part of the planet that's called the preserve, which we don't know how large it is. It's probably pretty big. We don't know how many humans are on the planet. We know why they came there. Basically, we don't know too many details. We know they were sort of escaping, but I don't know that you can have love in this sense of a loving, mutually respecting relationship between two people. And I don't think it has to do with the fact that one's basically a centipede monster and one is a human being. I think it's the power dynamics are completely off. If you're raised to believe that your only job is to reproduce, and oh my God, this is getting eerily close to Earth now, then how do you experience love? Does it get mutated and it's a different sort of version of love and not this idyllic romanticism that we all think about on Earth? Or is it the same thing? Can you experience love in this very oppressive society?
Yeah, thank you, Joey, for taking us there. Because one of the things that came up for me, yes, I agree this is a coming of age story. Like when you were reading, it's like Octavia Butler's like, let me tell you what the story is about. Thank you for reading my story. Now here is what I wanted you to have. And we're like, nope, nope, nope. Okay, coming of age, we'll agree with that. The rest of the stuff, we are seeing this very differently. I want to challenge you a bit about the love story. So for me, the love story was between the family members. And the mom wanted the best for her son. And she was like, I knew from your conception that you would have to be given away. One of my children needed to be sacrificed to the greater good. And I would rather do it with my best friend from childhood and give my baby to her than to have some random stranger do what they're going to do to you, to impregnate you, and the damage that will happen to that man's psyche and his physicality as a result of that procedure. But we do learn in the story that the father of Gan and his sisters and brothers, that dad had done that procedure 3 times. So
Hmm.
by the time he met the mom, they said he was like an older person, but he fathered 4 biological children, not mating with the alien species. So I thought that was interesting. The pivotal scene for me in that family dynamic is when he tells a toy, I don't want to do this. Like, I am just now realizing there's this thing called consent and autonomy, and I would like to exert some of it right now. And she's like, okay, fine. I will go get your sister. And he's like, whoa, 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 hold up. No, 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 no. A, I'm special. You have groomed me from my birth to be your special person. And now you're saying in a moment, I can be tossed aside and you will take my sister. I have some conflicting feelings about that. According to that character, he's like, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but oh, right. And then they're like, okay, we'll just do it tomorrow. And then he's like, wait, this is moving too fast. Then he thinks about it further and he's like, I don't want her to do that to my sister because that seems unfair to my sister. Like, I would rather take the physical, I don't want to say punishment, but I will accept my fate without trying to push that off on my sister. And he could have tried to push it off on like his crappy brother who seemed like really, really aggressive and anti-establishment. But he also said to someone, I would never ask my brother to do it because you can't create a life with someone who hates you. And I just thought that was really interesting, Joey. So for me, there was these family ideals of love. And I also agree with you. True love, in my worldview, cannot be extracted through force or through economic convenience or these power structures. And the end of the story, when they sort of have this, okay, go ahead, let's stick with our plan. You can impregnate me. I will suffer the consequences. And she's like, don't worry. I will always take care of you. I won't be negligent like that other lady was with her incubator man. I will take care of you. And it's like, but will you really? Maybe you will because you owe it to my mom. Maybe you love me, but it didn't strike me from this 20, 30-year distance that this was any type of equal relationship, even when they had this coming to terms conversation about, I want to consent to this being done to me. It's like, you can't consent to something that you've literally been groomed from birth. And they said the reason my brother couldn't be a good incubator is that they did not indoctrinate him on the rules from birth. It was too late to bring my brother on board. So I thought that was just super interesting about brainwashing and cultural expectations and grooming.
Yeah, I agree. You can't have I agree like there is love between the family, the human family. And I would even say that the Tillich families, they clearly love that they can have a litter, a litter of grubs or whatever they want to call it. So they're excited to give have offspring even though they're the male of their species is born to help them reproduce and then they quickly die, it seems like. But anyway, I think we do have this very tender moment when Gan is actually impregnated and it's like a sex scene, but it's not really a sex scene because they're not having sex. And I don't understand exactly where everything went in this story. She does not get that explicit. So you kind of have to, it says puncture. It was a puncture. So I'm assuming it was through the skin and not in an, in an orifice. Pretty safe to say. I'll just read this short paragraph. It's because it's very intimate and it's very tender in this moment. This is as the scene I was describing. So Butler writes, "Yet I undressed and lay down beside her. I knew what to do, what to expect. I had been told all my life. I felt the familiar sting, narcotic, mildly pleasant. Then the blind probing of her ovipositor. The puncture was painless, easy, so easy going in. She undulated slowly against me, her muscles forcing the egg from her body into mine. I held on to a pair of her limbs until I remembered Lomas holding her that way. Then I let go, moved inadvertently, and hurt her. She gave a low cry of pain, and I expected to be caged at once within her limbs. When I wasn't, I held on to her again, feeling oddly ashamed." This is a very sort of what? Now you want to read more?
I know I would love to hear what you're about to say, and
Oh,
then I have a very strong reaction to this particular
okay.
scene.
That's great. I'm not saying that this is love. I'm just saying I was not expecting it to be sort of like this tender moment where if this were two humans on Earth, this could be like, and not this exact same situation. If we're looking at just this excerpt, not the entire context, if we take it out of context, it does seem sort of like this very tender moment, whether it's romantic or not, but it seems like it's not meant to feel painful, obviously, because this alien species has a way to ease the pain from wherever they're puncturing their human. But yeah, it was unexpected, and I think showed that was the only case that I could make for this is a love story because there is clearly a respect that to goatees wants Gan to be comfortable in this moment, and she is trying her best, at least.
Okay, Joey, I will meet you halfway. I do see that, like, it's like he willingly laid down next to her and had accepted her embrace, and
Well,
they
I don't think that he willingly did it. I think I agree with you, but go ahead. Go ahead.
I agree we don't agree about what we agree on. Okay.
Yeah.
So I agree that this felt like an intimate, sort of tender moment, but Octavia Butler will not just let us have this moment because like, oh, it's painless. I got inseminated with the grub, the little baby grub, so now he's going to be the incubation mechanism. And he himself, as the male in this experience, moves somehow and ends up hurting his host. It's like, well, that's kind of a weird like dynamic. And then he said he felt ashamed. Did he feel ashamed because he hurt his person because he shifted somehow during this procedure and like he hurt Gayoti? Or did he feel ashamed because it was like, ew, like did I just like did I just do this? Like did I just get impregnated? Like is this happening for
Yeah.
real? It was just in for me it was a little ambiguous, but it was like one of the things that you had said in our previous conversations about world building that specific authors will say, no, 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 you don't get to have fantasy land. There's got to be some pain, some blood, some guts. Somebody's got to pay. So even in this, what was supposed to be a painless transaction, they have their saliva, their secretions are opiates, right? They give these eggs and they're narcotics to people. So
Hmm.
it was supposed to be super painless, and yet somebody still got hurt in that transaction, and it was like, that's just an interesting choice, Ms. Butler. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I think the idea of impregnating males is not completely alien because there are species, seahorses carry their young like that. So it's not completely incomprehensible. Obviously, if you think of, humans, if you're a cisgender man, you're not carrying children. It's something that struck me while I was reading this, and I was like, "Oh my God, this would never have crossed my mind, not in a million years, if I did not read this. Maybe if I read something else, but I didn't think about what happens to young girls or anybody that has ovaries. I'm gonna speak in binaries, but understand that I mean anybody that has ovaries. Okay, any young girls that are going through sex ed at school, or if a parent is so willing, I feel like that's usually not the case, to explain how sex works and how pregnancy and childbirth works. That imagine, I cannot imagine. Sorry, you can imagine. I cannot imagine as a young girl having to watch this and being told like that's your future, this is your expectation of you, is to go through this basically as many times as possible. This is like a weird way of explaining it, but that's basically what's happening. But like being like that looks like it hurts, and people are like, yeah, it's gonna hurt. It's a painful process. Nothing about this is a peaceful thing for you. Even during the actual pregnancy, you'll be uncomfortable. You can't get comfortable because you have this giant thing growing inside of your body that is basically doing the same thing as a grub is doing. It's feeding off of you. It's not going to eat through you, obviously, but yeah, I just thought like, wow, what a traumatic experience it must have been for girls and continues to be when you're forced to watch that. Like I was shown in sex ed childbirth videos. And I was like, wow, that's messed up. Like, that shouldn't happen like that. That doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem humane to me. But yeah, just I can't imagine that. And it really was so shocking to me as I'm 32 years old. And I never thought, like, how does that make girls feel when they are in sex ed or they're learning about this in whatever context? Like, how does that how is that not scarring for them to be like, oh my God, you're telling me I have to do that one day? I mean, you don't have to, obviously, but that's sort of the idea.
Or the corollary to that is like, oh, that's how that works. Whoa, isn't there like a better system? Because that seemed like a system that is not very well designed. Like, who designed the system? And Joey, thank you for like being so candid about your experience as a young person, kind of witnessing that, and also as an adult, going like, wait a second. How did that feel to be a 9-year-old girl or a 10-year-old girl watching these films in school with her peers, which girls and boys, at least in my sex ed education in Michigan, that what was that like for them? And I can say, because my mom had a huge extended family. There were babies, there was birth, there was all sorts of female energy floating around about various things that Octavia Butler does say something about it in this narrative. She said about Gan when he sees what actually happened to the man who was giving birth kind of unexpectedly, not in the right place. Like he was like on his way to meet the person he was supposed to be with, but he didn't. So
Mm,
again, it's like one of those crisis of like, oh no, the baby's coming. Like you have to do something right now. He said, there is no amount of diagrams or explanation that made that real to me until I saw that man, Joey, as you said, from neck to navel and below was slit open with the talon, with the fingernail of the alien creature. And was like, okay, time to open you up. And I thought that was also interesting that Octavia Butler's like, well, how else are they going to get out? They're going to have to split out through your skin. At least I gave you a slit that I could peel your body apart and remove these one by one. And Joey, what I really appreciated in the, as you said, this was very, very graphic, right? You cannot pretend that this was not explicit when they were talking about if you don't get all of the grubs out, right? And you don't
mm,
like know they didn't talk about a sonogram. You can't just be like, oh, you got 8 in there. We don't know. She's feeling around and she's like, oh, if I leave one of these little grubs, and she said, 10 centimeters long, look like little worms. If I left one of those in there, the guy will be eaten to death on the inside. And once that process starts, there's no backing up. So there's like no redo button. So you have to be
mm.
very probing to like make sure you're thorough to get all of the grubs out. And Joy, I appreciated when you said when the grubs were being born, she's like, oh, a male. Yay. Like she was so excited that there were now going to be able to have additional members of their society. So they're like, oh, we have lots of girls, but like the males were even prized in the grub community. So I was like, Miss Butler, what might you be telling us about your worldview and how people are valued? So it was just very interesting for me to think about what she put in, what she left out, and what questions she was asking us to just think about in our own experience.
Yeah, it's sort of strange when, I mean, I think traditionally, unfortunately, boys would be like the more prized one. Okay, but I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying that's traditional and, in cultures. So it's strange to be like, oh, they're excited to have a boy, not to carry on the family name or to take care of their elders, their parents when they're sick or old, that oh, you're going to do the bulk of the work and you're gonna live fast and you're gonna die young. And but that's your job. So it again, we see that role reversal with gender here. If we're talking about in binary terms, where the men of this species are used as tools to repopulate, and the women it has to be a matriarchal society by extension, because if the men cannot survive long enough, then they cannot lead. And we know that Tagotes is a politician of some sort. What I really liked about this story is we get some of the politics of this planet as well, which is a little segue that I wanted to I wanted to take here. I know we're already like over it, but oh my God, there's so many aspects of this. I thought it was really interesting, and we were talking about world building, and I swear this is going to get back to politics of this world, not reality, because you mentioned when you were reading the very first paragraph and a little bit of the second paragraph that you are curious about what's going to happen. We don't have context. We have no idea why they would be drinking eggs. Why they would get them sort of high, why it would prolong their life. That makes no sense. We have no context. There's no world building yet. And so there are sort of different ways that science fiction and fantasy writers can approach a story. One is that they sort of give you almost like sometimes it's a preface and sometimes it's sort of like info dumping at the very beginning of the story. Or they can go jump in head first and say, like, you're going to have to figure this out as we go along. And so it kind of just depends on the way you enjoy it, to like you like reading. This is a very exploratory way of going about writing a science fiction story, which I really like. I kind of like being left in the dark for a little bit and getting little pieces of information. But it's not until page 2 that we find out more concrete answer about what's going on. Why are these humans here? What's the interaction between them and the Tillich people? So I'll just read a little bit of what that says, because I think it's important to the story. So Tagoti was hounded on the outside. Her people wanted more of us made available. Only she and her political faction stood between us and the hordes who did not understand why there was a preserve, why any Terran could not be courted, paid, drafted, in some way made available to them. Or they did understand, but in their desperation they did not care. She parceled us out to the desperate and sold us to the rich and powerful for their political support. Thus, we were necessities, status symbols, and an independent people. She oversaw the joining of families, putting an end to the final remnants of the early system of breaking up Terran families to suit impatient Tillich. I had lived outside with her. I had seen the desperate eagerness in the way some people looked at me. It was a little frightening to know that only she stood between us and that desperation that could so easily swallow us. My mother would look at her sometimes and say to me, "Take care of her." And I would remember that she too had been outside, had seen. So we get a really good sense of what that power dynamic now is. We understand that whatever position Tagoti holds within her government is powerful enough to restrain the other people of her species from invading this preserve. And we already sort of get to know that the Terrans were not always treated with this type of respect or reverence, and that they are still being seen as sort of cattle, where they're a useful tool to procreate. And we get the idea that they are in high demand, and later we will learn more in the story that they were using whatever native species, animal species were on the planet, but it was not a viable host for their young. And then the humans came and they discovered like, wow, this really works. We should definitely use them.
Thanks for stopping by our planet. We have
Yeah.
plans for you. This is going to be great for us, not so much for you.
Yeah.
And Joey, I appreciate that, but and you're not going to see this coming, so I'm just going to say it. When I read that passage and heard you reading that, I'm like, okay, Lolita all over the place. It is this
Mhm.
grooming of young people to be victimized by the larger society that he was like, well, oh, when I was on the outside of the preserve, I palpably felt the lust, the bloodlust, the body, the embodiment of these people's desire to possess me for their own procreation needs, right? They're not eating them, they're not making them do jobs, they're not robots. No, the only reason they're trying to implant these humans is to perpetuate their own species, their own DNA, their own bloodline. And the fact that she calls this blood child, I'm like, there's so much in that. It's my bloodline. It's the fact that I'm a child. It's like children are created in this bloody mess. Like you had to slit this guy open and grab them out. Like there's just it was a very evocative title. I'll just say that. And it really I was very disturbed because when Gan asked to go tea, would you, if I said no, are you just going to go over to my sister? And she said, yes, I have to do it with someone today. Now, there was an urgency. There was something that just could not be postponed another moment. And early in the story, before we know how any of this stuff is going to go down, the mom and Tagoti, who are friends from childhood, so it's like, aunties kind of just hanging out together. It's like, oh, yeah, I've seen my kid since birth. This is great, says tomorrow. And she kind of like is getting this narcotic and she's kind of like drifting off into her narcotic high. And she said something very direct. She's like, I wouldn't have sold my son to you. I would not have given him up for anything. Right. And so and the author tells us, like, oh, she never would have said that had she not been under the effect of narcotics. And so there was just a lot of info for me, this underlying question of how do you control population when you have to put something unpleasant to them? Well, you give them these opiates, you give them something that they're addicted to. And even the brother that starts with a Q, not Gan, but
Uh,
Quai, Qui, that brother said, even though he hated the system, he hated their organizational, and he hated being oppressed, he never, ever, ever missed an opportunity to suck off of the narcotic egg. He's like, I am
mm,
down with the egg. Everything else, not for me. And I thought, I just really quickly want to take us here, Joey, and I'm going to explore this later, hopefully with you, about the time frame in which this was written. I'd like to do a whole other extra literary affair about that. But this was written in the mid 80s, right at the start of the crack cocaine epidemic, which was very devastating to the United States and especially to the African American urban population, of which Octavia Butler would have certainly been aware of. And so this overarching idea that you can control a group of people by keeping them intoxicated, by letting them just have this quick instantaneous escape from whatever's happening, I just thought was really interesting. I grew up in this time frame, 1984, just say no to drugs, the war on drugs, all of that stuff was really ever present. And the fact that this plays such a clear role about the only way this society is kind of getting away with what they're getting away with is that these people are powerless. And if they start asking questions or start getting a little uncomfortable, it's like, let me just sting you with my stinger or give you the egg, and that will just take your mind off it. We're just going to take the edge off. And I just
mm.
thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I think they're. it just complicates the story even more because you're like, how can you say that you're always high? So you can't say that you feel these emotions because,
But not always high because it does
yeah,
wear off. Because the
yeah,
guy was begging, like when we was in the process of giving birth, and he's like split open, and she's like, "I gave you as much as I like can actually give you without killing you, and as soon as this is over, I promise you, I'll give you so much more." And I was like, "Isn't that curious, Joey? Isn't that
yeah.
curious?"
It's another system of control, as you saw, another tool of control. But what's really interesting is that Gan's brother Kui was trying to get away once he happened to see a birthing process and was like, "Oh no, 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 no! That is not my life. I do not want to do that. I don't want to be cut open because first of all, the amount of bodily trauma that must happen. I mean, we even know that Gan's. This is a little tangent here, but Gan's dad did it 3 times over his however long he lived. And he lived an abnormally long life. So that means it was probably pretty traumatic to recover from, even with drugs and their saliva that was like closing off their vessels and stuff like that, or their whatever. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an alien doctor. But anyway, it was helping with this procedure. But Kui sees this accidentally. He's not supposed to. Just like Gan is not supposed to witness this. And that is the impetus for him to double down on his addiction to these narcotic drugs of the egg and the stinger. And he talks about how he tries to escape, but he's running around in a cage. You can't escape this cage. So this was his only option, was to say, I literally tried to get away. I tried to improve my life. I'm stuck on this preserve on an alien planet where if I go outside, somebody's probably going to kidnap him and impregnate him and keep him as a literal piece of livestock. Again, I mean, I know this story wasn't supposed to be about slavery, but this is just very reminiscent of what could have happened. It's sort of just devastating that he had no other choice. It was like, I will surrender to all of this numbing because I literally don't have another choice to make. I can't go out and get a job. This is not an option for them. They do work on the preserve, but they can't go out and start a small business, open up a Tillich cafe or something like that.
Joey, thank you for saying that because I have two responses to that. When we know that Gan is talking to Goatee and he asks, he'll live then, like the man who had just given birth. Yes. I wonder if he would do it again. No one would ask him to do that again. I looked into the yellow eyes, wondering how much I saw and understood there, and how much I only imagined. No one ever asked us, I said. You never asked me. And so it's this moment of reckoning of where he's like, by the way, like you didn't ask me if I wanted to do this the first time. And they're like, oh no, once you go through that procedure once, like no one would force, no one would ask you to do it again. But to your very clear point, Joey, the father, under whatever circumstances, has done this procedure 3 times before he was released to go have his natural born human family with his wife, because the brother said, the two brothers were talking, the ruling class would prefer to have women, but they can't have women because those women need to go have human babies to keep our supply up. We have to restock these shelves with humans. And if we get rid of
Yeah.
all the women, we are going to be in trouble. So, like, let's just take these expendable men. And that's why she was always like, you need to eat something, like, you need to fatten up. And they're like, women are more hospitable hosts because their physiology was better for these invading species, but they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. So I thought that was just such a super interesting point, and about the slavery piece and about PTSD. So we get the idea that Kui is just this rebellious, kind of antisocial, unfun brother. Like he's the problematic one. And Gan is like, I don't even like my brother. We were fine as kids, then something happened in adolescence, and now there's definitely something wrong with my brother. Like he is just not right. Well, we find out what happened was a PTSD incident where he accidentally sees a human man consumed by these alien species as a result of this botched birthing process. And he's like, oh, he was begging his impregnator. I don't know what you'd call her in my mind, in my binary terms, his wife, his
Mm-hmm.
wife. He's like, please just kill me. And she's like, okay. And she slits his throat, and then the little babies come out and like devour the thing. And this teenage kid is watching, and he's super traumatized, obviously, as any person might be in that situation, but he doesn't tell anybody about it. So he just goes off and becomes a moody teenager. And this moment of empathy where he can, even though he's being kind of a jerk to his brother, it's like, you do not know what is coming for you, buddy. Like, let me just tell you how life is going to be. We get this very empathetic moment between the two of them of like, please let me tell you what my experience was and why I am the way I am. And I love that. So, like, for me, that was a beautiful part of the story. That did not have to be included in a science fiction slasher, death and defiance kind of story. It was more of a moral tale of if you don't tell your truth, even if you tell your truth for kind of a crappy reason, like the older brother was trying to be a little hurtful to the younger brother, telling his truth, I think, released something and created a bond between those two brothers that now is stronger than it was before. So, Joey, I have so much to say about all of the other layers. So I know I look forward to our next conversation about the story. For lack of a better word, yes, it is a science fiction story. That is correct. Read it. It's gruesome. It's gross. It's world building. It's all the things a person may love about science fiction. But a person who may not be a science fiction enthusiast, there is so much about larger moral questions, how we decide what world we want to live in. How do we work with the constraints of the society that we're given? How do you connect emotionally with another person when they may or may not be capable of that? Who are you in the context of the relationships that you have and the place in society? Like all of those things are explored in this teeny tiny little story. And I thought that was really beautiful and worthwhile.
Yeah, definitely don't be. Sometimes science fiction is just for fun. There's plenty of books that are just for fun or just stories that are just for fun. But authors like Octavia Butler or N.K. Jemisin, because we also read her, also a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship,
More of your
which is,
geniuses, Joey. You always tell me
wow,
these people are geniuses.
they're
Certified.
both literally genius. Okay. Although there was a funny interview that Octavia E. Butler did with, I think his name's Charlie Rose. It's from like the 90s. I end up watching a bunch of them because he interviewed a lot of authors and Toni Morrison did a bunch of his and I love them. Anyway, he was saying like, oh, you got the MacArthur Fellowship grant. And she's like, that's, I don't know why people call it that. It's not called that. She's like, if that's what it was called, I probably wouldn't get it. And I was like, girl, you would have gotten it. She just has this aura of like pure genius. You're like, oh my God, I can't hang. Like I love reading your stuff, but there's some people that I'm like, I couldn't have a conversation with you, not because I don't want to, but just it would be extremely obvious that I was not as smart. Highly suggest people do not hold that against this story or other works like that, and I'm including N.K. Jemisin as well, that it's really to disarm you, I think. It's also because they enjoy it and that's the medium that they like, but I think it's really to be a little jarring and to disarm you, like I said, so that you're more willing to receive the message that they're trying to tell you. But yes, I think there's so much more to talk about in this story, so we'll definitely have to continue it and continue reading Octavia Butler because, of course, this is part of a collection. And I just checked and I have the 2005 edition, so I have the extra stories.
Bonus material. Thank you,
Yeah.
Joey. I will have to catch up with that. And just as you were recounting the two authors that we have just fallen in love with their writing, and they are geniuses, but part of their genius is their direct and clear writing to make us feel all of these emotions in such a compact form. And one of the things Octavia Butler said, she's like, in my heart, I'm a novelist, right? I want all this space. But sometimes there's a story that is only going to be a short story, and this is one of those stories. And so I also loved her self understanding and her very clear idea that some stories need a very expansive world to be creative and like more time and space. And some stories can just be that moment in time where she told you everything she needed to tell you about that story. And so I just really appreciated that. So, yes, Joey, I am committing to you and to our listeners to do a part two about this story to maybe talk a little bit more about the writing process and all of the topics that we did not get a chance to discuss in this episode. So, thank you so much, Joey.
Sounds good.
Oh, and one last thing I wanted to say. Both of these writers did something very similar. They lulled us into this fantasy world about creating all of this great stuff, and then they stuck us with a stinger and infected us with an idea that we just can't shake. So both they did that literally in their stories, but I think they also did that in our psyche, and I am grateful for that.
So next week, we're going to be reading Mr. Salary by Sally Rooney, and it's available for free on granadamagazine.com. This is not sponsored.
Excellent, Joey. So this will be a non-science fiction read, correct? Sally Rooney, she
No,
has her
no
own
science fiction.
universe, but it is not science fiction.
Thank you for listening to the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And don't worry, it'll be our little secret you stepped out of your literary comfort zone. Check out our link tree to follow us on TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky, and Storygraph.